The phone lay on the table, screen glowing, my name unacknowledged. I dialed again, only to meet the flat, mechanical voice. "This number is blocked." Outside, the wind rattled the tin mailbox he painted for me when his hands were still small, still gentle. I didn't cry. Instead, I turned the phone over, face down, and thought of the account I opened for him 20 years ago, still in my name, still holding more than he remembered. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below and don't forget to press the subscribe button. The smell of toast used to fill our mornings. Back then, it was just the two of us in that narrow little apartment above the laundromat, with its humming floorboards and windows that caught the sunrise like stained glass. I would make him cinnamon toast before school, sprinkling sugar in a way that made him laugh, because he said I always used too much. I didn't mind the teasing. That laugh was worth every grain. I raised my son alone. His father was a shadow in our lives, never cruel, just absent, like a book you meant to read but left on a shelf too long. I learned quickly that I couldn't rely on anyone else to keep the light in our home, so I built it myself, one day, one meal, one bedtime story at a time. My bookkeeping work was steady, if modest. In the evenings, after dinner, I'd sit at the kitchen table balancing numbers while he colored beside me. Sometimes he'd ask what I was doing, and I'd explain in simple terms. "I'm making sure the money doesn't run away." He'd nod solemnly, as if we were co-conspirators in a secret mission. When he turned 6, I took him to the bank. It was a small branch, the kind where the tellers knew your name and kept peppermints in glass bowls. We opened a savings account in his name, but I was the main account holder. I slid the first envelope of coins across the counter, telling him this was his future box. He asked if we could check it like a toy chest, and I told him no. It was for later, for when life would need it most. He didn't fully understand, but he liked the idea of having something sleeping for him at the bank. We had our routines, our rituals. Saturday mornings meant pancakes and cartoons. In summer, we'd walk to the park with a paper bag of stale bread for the ducks. He'd throw the bread too far, and I'd tell him the ducks closer to the bank were hungrier. In winter, we'd huddle under blankets with mugs of cocoa, the steam fogging his glasses. He was my boy, my whole world, and I poured myself into him as if love alone could weatherproof a life. But love, I learned, isn't always enough to keep the edges from fraying. Even in those good years, there were threads I didn't notice coming loose. It started small, him rolling his eyes when I reminded him to do homework, sighing when I asked him to pick up his socks. Normal, I told myself. All children test boundaries. But there were moments, even then, where I caught something sharp in his tone, something that made me pause. Still, his kindness often outweighed the rest. He'd bring me little treasures from the playground, a smooth stone, a bottle cap he swore was lucky. Once, on Mother's Day, he made me a card out of notebook paper, spelling, "You are my hero" in big, uneven letters. I tucked it away in the back of my drawer where it still rests. The summers were my favorite. I'd close my ledgers early and take him to the community pool. He wasn't much of a swimmer, but he loved splashing in the shallow end, always waving at me to watch. I remember the way his hair stuck to his forehead, how his smile could outshine even the hottest afternoon. I made sacrifices, though I rarely called them that. When he needed new cleats for soccer, I skipped buying a winter coat for myself that year. When he wanted to go on the school trip, I took on an extra client, working late into the night while he slept. These choices never felt like burdens. They felt like what mothers were meant to do, quietly bending their lives so their children could stand taller. He grew quickly. By the time he was in middle school, he towered over the kitchen counter, making his own sandwiches. He'd still humor me with the occasional board game, but more often than not, he'd retreat to his room with his phone or laptop. I told myself this was normal. He was becoming independent, self-sufficient. That's what I had raised him for, wasn't it? And yet, I clung to our shared history, to the symbols that reminded me of the boy he had been. The old bank passbook was one of them. Every few months we'd make a deposit, birthday money, a portion of his summer job earnings when he was old enough. He treated it like a chore, but I insisted. "Someday you'll thank me," I'd say. He'd smile faintly, not quite believing me. Looking back, I see that these were the golden years, though at the time they felt ordinary. I was too busy holding our life together to notice how quietly the seasons were changing. On quiet nights, after he went to bed, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the street lamp's halo in the fog. I remember thinking, we made it. It's not perfect, but we're okay. I didn't know then how quickly okay can become something else entirely. The first time my son raised his voice at me, it was over a missing sweatshirt. I'd put it in the wash, thought I was doing him a kindness, but he came storming into the kitchen, his voice sharper than I had ever heard. "Why do you always move my stuff?" he demanded. The toast popped up from the old toaster at that exact moment, the smell of butter filling the air, but it didn't soften him. His eyes were narrowed, his shoulders tense. I told him I was just trying to help, but he rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath as he left. It was such a small thing, barely worth mentioning at the time, but it lodged somewhere in me. I stood there, one hand still resting on the toaster, feeling the warmth fade from my fingers. His teenage years arrived like a change in weather, subtle at first, then all at once. He began coming home later, often without calling. The boy who used to chatter about his day over dinner now gave one-word answers, his attention already drifting toward his phone. There was a new group of friends, boys who dressed in expensive sneakers and carried themselves like they owned the sidewalk. They'd drop him off sometimes in cars that smelled faintly of cologne and fast food. I'd wave from the porch, but he'd barely look up, mumbling a quick bye before disappearing inside. I told myself it was normal. This was the age where friends became the center of the universe. But something in his manner changed too. He began speaking differently, faster and louder in public, but with me his words grew clipped, almost perfunctory. One evening, I overheard him on the phone with one of those boys. His tone was warm, even playful. When I asked who he was talking to, he shrugged and said, "No one," before heading to his room. There were still moments that reassured me. He'd help me carry groceries in from the car without being asked. He'd ask me to taste test a sandwich he made, pretending he was running a restaurant. But more often, there was a kind of performance to it, like he was humoring me before moving on to something more important. I noticed, too, that he became more sensitive about money. When I suggested he set aside part of his allowance, he scoffed, saying it was pointless to save pennies. The savings account I had nurtured for years became a joke to him, something old-fashioned, like a rotary phone. "Everyone just uses cards now, Mom," he said once, pulling out his debit card with a flick of the wrist. I smiled, but inside I felt the faintest sting. That account wasn't just about money. It was about a lesson, a kind of anchor. Watching him dismiss it so easily made me wonder if other things I'd taught him had slipped away just as quietly. By his last year of high school, we were more like polite housemates than mother and son. We still had our Sunday dinners, but they were shorter now. Sometimes I'd spend more time listening to the hum of the refrigerator than to his answers. One night, he came home smelling faintly of something I couldn't place. Not alcohol exactly, but the kind of scent that lingers when you've been somewhere you shouldn't. I didn't accuse him. I simply asked if he'd had a good time. He nodded, then asked if I could lend him money for a school thing. I gave it to him, even though part of me knew the truth didn't match the words. I think that was when I started collecting these small moments like beads on a string, tiny, isolated instances that, when laid end to end, began to form a pattern I didn't want to see. The charm he showed others never faded. At the grocery store, he'd greet the cashier warmly, joke with the bagger. Teachers praised his leadership in group projects. But with me, his warmth came in flashes, like sunlight slipping between clouds. Once during a parent-teacher meeting, his history teacher said, "You must be so proud of him." And I truly was. But I also knew that pride had started to feel like a coat that didn't fit the same way anymore. Still mine, still warm, but not quite comfortable. On his graduation day, he hugged me for the photos, grinning wide for the camera. The tassel from his cap brushed my cheek. For a moment, I let myself believe we were still as close as we'd always been. But later that night, as I cleaned up the kitchen, I found his phone on the counter, screen lit with a message from one of his friends. "Party tonight. No parents allowed." I placed the phone back exactly as I'd found it. That was the thing about the early cracks. They didn't split the whole structure right away. They were just hairline fractures, easy to overlook if you didn't press too hard. But I could feel the strain in the walls of what we had built. I just didn't know then how wide those cracks would grow. The first time he didn't come home for Sunday dinner, it was raining. I had made his favorite, roast chicken with rosemary, the smell filling the house from mid-afternoon. I'd even baked a small apple pie, knowing he liked it warm with ice cream. An hour before he was due, my phone buzzed. "Can't make it tonight. Busy." No explanation. No "sorry." Just 2 words and the unshakable feeling that the table was too big for one person. I wrapped the chicken in foil and put it in the fridge. The pie I left on the counter until it cooled, then sliced a piece for myself. It tasted like something half forgotten. When he moved into his own apartment a few months later, I tried to make it an occasion. We borrowed my friend's truck and spent the day hauling second-hand furniture, a couch from my neighbor's basement, a set of mismatched dishes from a yard sale. I even gave him my spare set of pots, the ones I'd used since he was little. He didn't thank me that day, not really. He said, "Yeah, this'll do," and disappeared into the bedroom to check his phone. I told myself he was tired, that gratitude would come later. But later came and went without it. Our phone calls grew shorter. At first they were still regular, 2 or 3 times a week, but always on his terms. He'd call on his walk to work or while waiting in line somewhere, the sound of other voices in the background. When I tried to ask about his day, he'd say, "Can we talk later?" But later never came. The Sunday dinners dwindled too. Sometimes he'd say he had to work, sometimes that he was meeting friends. I started cooking less on weekends, just in case. It felt strange to cook for one without planning for 2. Once when I was in his neighborhood, I decided to drop off an envelope with a little extra cash, just in case, I wrote on a note inside. I slipped it under his door, imagining the way he might smile when he found it. But when I visited the next week, the envelope was gone and he didn't mention it. It wasn't the money. It was the silence around it, as if my gesture had landed in an empty room. When we did meet, it was different. He'd check his phone mid-conversation, his eyes darting to the screen like I was a program running in the background. He'd talk about things happening in his life, but never ask about mine. I didn't think he meant it as unkindness. It just didn't occur to him that I had a life worth asking about. One evening I ran into him unexpectedly. I was at the market picking through the apples when I saw him across the produce aisle. He was with a young woman, her hand looped through his arm. He didn't see me at first, so I had a moment to take in how he smiled at her. Warm, easy, a smile that belonged entirely to that moment. When he did notice me, he waved, but didn't come over. "I'll call you later," he mouthed. I nodded, but my hands tightened around the apples until my knuckles ached. The call came 2 days later. Short, distracted. He didn't mention the woman. I didn't ask. Sometimes I think about how distance doesn't always arrive like a slammed door. It can seep in quietly, like water through a crack in the roof. You don't notice until the ceiling sags. It was around this time that I stopped expecting much. Not in a bitter way, but in the way you stop expecting winter to be warm. I began making peace with his absences before they happened, setting the table for one without hesitation. Still, I kept up my small habits of care. I'd text him when the lilac bush in the yard bloomed early, or when the first snow fell. I'd send pictures of the pie cooling on the counter, or the roses I'd planted along the fence. Sometimes he'd reply with a thumbs-up emoji. Sometimes not at all. The funny thing is, I never stopped loving him. The love just shifted into a quieter shape. Less about sharing life, more about holding a steady place for him in mine, even if he rarely stepped into it anymore. But in the quiet spaces between our contact, I began to notice something else. The savings account. It was still in my name, still active. Every month I'd check the balance, the neat black numbers like a reminder carved in stone. It was a tether, whether he realized it or not. At the time, I didn't see it as power. I saw it as responsibility. But the idea that I still held a corner of his future in my hands lingered at the edge of my thoughts, like a bookmark I hadn't moved in years. I didn't know yet how that tether would be pulled, how it would one day be the last thread between us. But even then, I think I knew that small distances can grow into canyons if you stop building bridges. It was a Tuesday evening when I found out. I had just finished washing the dishes, the smell of lemon soap still on my hands, when my neighbor's daughter, Emily, sent me a photo through social media. She was beaming in the picture, her arm draped over my son's shoulder, the two of them surrounded by balloons and cake. "Happy birthday, Alex," the caption read. For a moment, I thought there must be some mistake. His birthday wasn't until the end of the week, but then I looked closer. There he was, holding a slice of cake, grinning at a table crowded with friends. The living room behind him was unmistakable. His apartment, the couch I had helped carry up those narrow stairs. I stared at the picture for a long time, the laughter frozen in pixels. My own reflection hovered faintly on the screen, like I was standing just outside that room, invisible. I picked up the phone and called him. It rang twice before he answered. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone casual. "Happy early birthday," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I saw Emily's post." There was a pause. "Oh, yeah, it was just a thing. Just friends." "Friends," I repeated, as if tasting the word. "I didn't realize I wasn't on the list." He chuckled lightly, the sound oddly distant. "It wasn't that kind of party. You wouldn't have had fun." I wanted to say I would have liked the chance to decide that for myself. I wanted to ask why my seat at his table had been quietly removed. Instead, I heard myself say, "I see," in a voice that didn't sound like mine. We hung up a minute later, the conversation thinning like smoke. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying the image of his smile, the one that used to be mine too. I thought about the years of birthday cakes I had baked, the scavenger hunts I'd planned, the way he'd tear into gifts with paper flying everywhere. I wondered when exactly my presence had stopped being a gift and become an inconvenience. In the days that followed, I tried to push it aside. I told myself it was just a phase, that young people sometimes pull away. But the truth sat heavier than I wanted to admit. He hadn't just forgotten me. He had chosen not to include me. I didn't tell anyone about the party. Not my neighbor. Not my friends from church. It felt too much like revealing a bruise before it had faded. Instead, I busied myself with work, with the garden, with cleaning out the attic. One afternoon, while sorting through an old box of his school projects, I found a birthday card he'd made for me in second grade. A big red heart colored in crayon with the words, "To Mom, you're my best friend." The edges of the paper were soft with age, the handwriting shaky but full of care. I sat on the attic floor holding that card, dust settling around me like snow. Somewhere between that moment and the party I hadn't been invited to, the road between us had cracked wide enough to lose my footing. He didn't call me for the rest of that week. When I finally sent him a message, just a simple "hope you had a good day," it went unanswered. I began noticing the way my phone stayed silent more often. The sound of it not ringing became a kind of background hum, something I almost expected. Still, I tried to keep the bridge standing. I left a small birthday gift at his door the next week, a book I thought he'd like, wrapped in brown paper with a ribbon. I didn't include a card. Somehow the idea of writing "Love, Mom" felt heavier than I could bear just then. A few days later I saw the ribbon in his trash bin when I stopped by to drop off some mail. The book was nowhere in sight. That was when I felt it, a quiet shift inside me. Not anger exactly, not yet, but a cooling, like the air when the sun dips behind a cloud. Something in me stopped leaning forward toward him. I began holding myself still, waiting to see if he would notice the space growing. I doubt he did. The following Sunday I didn't invite him to dinner. I cooked for myself, just a small pot of soup, and ate it at the kitchen table with the radio playing softly in the background. The chair across from me stayed empty, and for the first time I didn't imagine him sitting there. That night I went to bed early. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel lonely but now felt like something else, something like relief. If your own child started shutting you out of their life piece by piece, what would you do? The weeks after his birthday passed without a single call. At first, I kept glancing at my phone, expecting it to light up with his name. I even checked the ringer once, convinced it must be turned off. But no, the silence wasn't technical, it was intentional. I filled the quiet with small routines. Mornings became my sanctuary. I'd wake before the sun, put on the kettle, and sit at the kitchen table with my tea, watching the first light soften the edges of the yard. The radio would murmur in the background, news, weather, the easy rhythm of voices that asked nothing of me. In the garden I found a kind of steadiness. The lilac bush bloomed early that spring, its fragrance drifting through the open windows. I'd planted it when Alex was in middle school, after he'd brought me a sprig from the park saying, "It smells like happy." That memory rose with the scent, bittersweet and uninvited. I left him a voicemail about the lilacs, just a small message, nothing urgent. I imagined him hearing my voice, maybe smiling at the reminder, but there was no reply. A few days later I was walking home from the post office when I saw him across the street. He was with two friends, laughing about something, the easy kind of laughter that comes when you feel you belong. For a second I hesitated, thinking maybe I'd wave, maybe even cross the street. But before I could decide, he glanced in my direction. Our eyes met. It was quick, almost accidental, but unmistakable. And then, nothing. He turned back to his friends and kept walking. I stood there, rooted to the sidewalk, the envelope in my hand suddenly feeling heavy. The spring breeze carried the faint scent of lilac from somewhere, but it didn't smell like happy anymore. When I got home, I didn't leave another voicemail. The days stretched. I noticed small changes in my own behavior. I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning. I stopped saving bits of news or recipes I thought he'd enjoy. It wasn't a decision, I just didn't anymore. I began to bake again, but not for anyone else. One rainy afternoon, I made a loaf of banana bread, letting the smell fill the house. I cut a thick slice while it was still warm, the steam curling upward like a secret I had no intention of sharing. There were moments of beauty in those weeks, quiet victories, though I didn't think of them that way at the time. The first daffodils pushing through the soil, the way the late afternoon sun turned the kitchen walls gold, the soft, almost imperceptible lift in my chest when I realized an entire day had passed without thinking of whether or not he might call. Still, the absence was there, like a shadow that followed me into every room. It sat at the edge of conversations with friends, unspoken but present. People would ask about him, how he was doing, whether he'd come by lately, and I'd smile, say, "He's busy," and change the subject. One evening I heard the creak of the mailbox outside and went to check. Inside was a single envelope addressed to him, no return address. I didn't open it, just set it aside for the next time I might see him. Weeks later, it was still on the side table by the door, gathering a fine layer of dust. Sometimes, in the middle of folding laundry or watering the plants, I'd feel a sudden urge to call him, just to hear his voice. But the thought of hearing that cool, distracted tone, of being met with short answers or no answer at all, kept me from dialing. The lilacs eventually faded, their petals scattering across the grass like pale confetti. I swept them up one afternoon, the broom making soft, dry sounds against the walk. It struck me then that even beauty, if ignored long enough, will fall away unnoticed. That night I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the street lamps flicker on. The air was cool, the kind that hints at summer but still carries a whisper of spring. For the first time in weeks, I didn't imagine him walking up the steps. It wasn't that I didn't want him to. It was that I'd stopped expecting him to. And there's a difference. It was late in the afternoon when he called. His voice was different, warm at first, almost the way it used to be. He said he was in a bit of a bind and needed help with rent. His paycheck had been delayed and the landlord was breathing down his neck. There was no hesitation on my part. I didn't even ask for details. "Of course," I said. "Come by this evening and I'll give you what you need." When he arrived, he stood in the doorway, shifting from one foot to the other. His hair was unkempt, his eyes tired. I told him to sit down, but he waved me off, saying he was in a hurry. I counted the cash into his hand, more than he'd asked for, telling him it should cover rent and groceries until his next paycheck. He mumbled, "Thanks, Mom," tucking the bills into his pocket, and was gone before the kettle on the stove even reached a boil. I told myself it felt good to help him. That's what parents do. Even when the relationship is strained, they catch their children before they fall too hard. But a part of me couldn't help noticing how quickly he'd left, how little space he'd given for gratitude. 2 days later, I overheard the truth. I was in line at the coffee shop when I saw a familiar face, Rachel, the daughter of an old friend. She was talking to someone behind me, and though I wasn't trying to listen, her words carried clearly over the low hum of the shop. "And Alex showed up. You should have seen the place. Beach house, 3 days, all paid for. He even bought drinks for everyone." I froze. My hands tightened around the cup I was holding. My name hadn't been mentioned, but it didn't need to be. I knew exactly where the money had come from. For the rest of the day, I went about my chores as usual. Laundry, garden, bookkeeping, but everything felt muted, as if someone had turned the world's volume down. That night, I sat in the living room with the lamp on, staring at the small ledger where I kept track of my expenses. I had written "Alex, rent help" in neat, careful letters. I took out my pen and added a question mark. I didn't call him to confront him. I didn't even let him know I knew. It wasn't pride or fear. It was something quieter, colder. I was beginning to understand that talking to him wouldn't change anything. But I also began thinking about the bank account. It had been sitting there for years, an invisible thread between us. I'd been the one to open it, to make sure it grew, to keep it safe. It was in his name, yes, but I still had full control. He had probably forgotten that detail. I didn't decide anything that night. I just sat there, tracing the edge of the ledger page with my finger, remembering the first time we'd walked into the bank together. He'd been 6, holding my hand so tightly his fingers were damp with sweat. We'd deposited a handful of coins and he'd looked up at me like we were planting something that would grow forever. Now the thought that I could pull it all back into my hands, take it away, felt both foreign and strangely fitting. The next day I went about my life as usual. I baked bread, pruned the roses, cleaned out a drawer in the kitchen, but somewhere under the surface something had shifted. Later that week, a small envelope came in the mail from the bank, a routine statement. I slid it out and looked at the balance. The number was solid, steady, the product of years of deposits, enough to make a difference in someone's life, enough to vanish in an instant if someone wasn't careful. I tucked the statement back into the envelope, but the image of that balance stayed with me. For the first time, the account didn't feel like a gift I was keeping for him. It felt like a lever. It happened on an ordinary morning. The kettle was just beginning to whistle, the sound weaving into the bird song outside, when I decided to call him. No reason, just a passing urge to hear his voice, to tell him the roses had bloomed early this year. I pressed his name on my phone. It rang once, then twice, and then the call dropped. I frowned, tried again. This time, there was no ring at all, just a flat, mechanical voice. "The number you are trying to reach is not accepting calls at this time." I stared at the screen, the steam from the kettle curling into my face. My first thought was that his phone was broken. My second was that something had happened to him. But when I called again, the message repeated, precise and cold. A strange, prickling heat spread through me. I reached for the landline. Yes, I still kept one, and dialed. The same message. It took me a moment to realize what it meant. Blocked. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands still damp from washing the morning dishes. I didn't move for a long time, listening to the kettle whistle itself into silence. Part of me wanted to deny it. Maybe it was a mistake, a technical glitch. But the truth pressed against me, unyielding. People don't block numbers by accident. I thought of the first phone I'd ever bought him. It was his 14th birthday, a modest little flip phone with silver buttons. He'd opened the box and grinned so wide I thought my heart might burst. "So I can call you whenever," he'd said. I'd made him promise to answer every time. And now, this. I didn't cry. Not right away. Instead, I got up, opened the cupboard, and poured myself a cup of tea. The liquid trembled slightly in the mug, the way my hands were trembling. It was only after I sat back down that the tears came, quiet, hot, and unannounced. Not because I couldn't reach him, but because I knew he didn't want me to. The rest of the day moved around me like slow water. I did my work, tended the garden, answered emails. But in the spaces between tasks, the thought returned, heavy as stone. He had shut the door completely. That evening, curiosity got the better of me. I borrowed my friend Margaret's phone, told her I needed to check something, and dialed his number. It rang. Not only did it ring, but he answered on the second tone, his voice light, like nothing had happened. "Hey, man," he said quickly before I could speak. Then there was laughter in the background, and he hung up. I handed the phone back to Margaret, who didn't ask any questions, though she gave me a look that said she knew better than to press. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint shadows from the street lamp swaying on the plaster. I thought about all the ways I could respond. Call from another number, show up at his apartment, demand an explanation. But the truth was, I didn't want to demand anything from him anymore. The bank statement from last week sat on my nightstand. I reached for it, tracing the numbers with my fingertip. For years, I'd thought of that account as his, even though my name still sat above his on every piece of paper. I'd kept it safe for him, believing it was an act of love. But love without respect is a rope tied to nothing. I could feel something changing in me, a quiet, almost imperceptible tilt. I wasn't plotting revenge yet, but I was beginning to understand that I didn't have to remain on the losing end of this distance. The next morning, I made a list. Not a list of what I would do to him, but of what I could do for myself. It was short, just 3 items, but the act of writing it made me feel less like I was waiting and more like I was moving. He didn't know it, but the same door he had slammed shut on me could swing the other way. And when it did, I would be the one holding the key. If your child cut off all contact without a word, how would you respond? The days after he blocked me had a strange stillness to them. Not an empty stillness, but the kind you find in the woods after a heavy snowfall, when the air feels padded and every sound is sharper for having to push through it. I stopped checking my phone altogether. I left it on the counter, face down, for hours at a time. The absence of his voice was no longer a question mark. It was a fact. Facts are easier to live with than questions. Instead, I turned my attention inward. One rainy afternoon, I climbed into the attic with a box of tea and a single lamp. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint smell of cedar from an old chest. I began opening boxes I hadn't touched in years, photo albums, letters, bits of schoolwork he'd made in elementary school. Near the bottom of a stack of papers, I found the original bank documents from when I'd opened his account. The paper was crisp, the ink still dark. My name, written in looping pen strokes, was above his in a smaller, neater print. I sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing that piece of paper with my fingertips. I remembered the day so vividly, how small his hand had been in mine, how he'd stared at the teller's counting machine like it was magic. Back then, the account had been a promise. Now, it felt like something entirely different, a tether I could either pull or cut. I placed the papers carefully back in the folder but kept them near, as though their weight on the floor beside me gave me some invisible grounding. The following morning I woke early and walked to the market. I bought only what I needed: bread, cheese, a handful of apples, but the act of choosing felt deliberate, intentional. I was making small decisions entirely for myself again. Over the next few days, I began a quiet sort of inventory, not just of things, but of habits, routines, and even relationships. Who checked on me without asking for something? Which parts of my life felt like they were waiting for him to fill? Which ones had space to grow without him? I pulled out my old ledger, the one I'd used for years to keep track of both my household expenses and the account's activity. Flipping through the pages, I could see the history of my care for him in neat columns: deposits from birthday money, summer jobs, my own contributions. There were even notes in the margins: for car insurance someday, college books, future rent. Reading those entries now was like walking through an abandoned house you once loved, everything familiar but covered in a fine dust of neglect. One evening I took a long bath, the steam curling against the mirror. I thought about how much of myself I had poured into him, not just money, but time, thought, hope, and how much of that had been spent without so much as acknowledgement. The next day I began a new notebook, not a ledger. This one was for me alone. The first page I titled "What I Still Hold." The list was simple: my home, my work, my health, my dignity, and his bank account. Seeing it in ink lined up among the other things that were mine shifted something inside me. It wasn't about vengeance yet. It was about reclaiming what I had overlooked, that I still had choices. I started going on morning walks again, something I hadn't done in years. There was a trail near the river where the air smelled faintly of pine and the water caught the light in quicksilver flashes. The rhythm of my steps became a kind of thinking drumbeat. With each mile, the knot in my chest loosened a little. One morning, as I passed the lilac bush outside my fence, I noticed new buds forming for a second bloom. It was unusual, rare for them to flower twice in a season. I took it as a quiet sign that life too could surprise you when you thought it was done giving. I didn't tell him about the blooms. I didn't reach for my phone at all. And for the first time, the choice not to share felt like strength, not loss. By the end of that week, the idea of going to the bank no longer felt like crossing a line. It felt like stepping onto solid ground. I wasn't ready yet, but I knew I would be. The morning I decided to go to the bank was cool and sharp, the kind of air that makes you feel more awake than coffee ever could. I dressed simply, navy sweater, black trousers, shoes that made no sound on the pavement. There was no part of me that wanted to look hurried or uncertain. The branch was only a few blocks away. I had been walking through its doors for over 2 decades, first with him in tow, his sneakers squeaking on the tiled floor, later on my own, depositing checks with the quiet satisfaction of keeping a promise. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and the citrus polish they used on the counters. The same arrangement of potted plants flanked the entrance, leaves glossy under the fluorescent lights. Mary Ann was behind the counter that day, tall, silver-haired, and always in a blazer the color of strong tea. She'd been there since the beginning, one of the few constants in a bank that had otherwise modernized into glass and metal. "Morning," she said with a smile that was half professional, half genuine. "How's the garden?" "Blooming twice this year," I told her, and she nodded like she understood the deeper meaning. I asked to speak to her privately. In her small office at the side of the lobby, I took a seat across from her desk. I didn't rush. "It's about the account I opened for my son years ago," I said. "I'm still the controlling holder." She looked at her screen, then back at me. "Yes, you are. Everything's in order. Do you want to make a change?" I folded my hands in my lap. "I'd like to freeze withdrawals, temporarily. I want to be notified of any attempts to move funds." Her brows lifted slightly, but she didn't ask why. "I can do that," she said. "You'll still have full access, of course." "Good," I replied. "That's what I want." The printer hummed, spitting out a form. I signed where she indicated, my pen stroke steady, deliberate. Each letter of my name felt like a stitch closing something up. When it was done, she slid a copy toward me. "It'll take effect immediately," she said. "If there's any attempt to withdraw, you'll get a call." "Thank you, Mary Ann," I said, meeting her eyes. She didn't smile this time, but there was a flicker of recognition in her expression, something between respect and caution. When I stepped outside, the air felt even cooler, cleaner. The sun had come out while I'd been inside, throwing bright shards of light across the sidewalk. On the walk home, I stopped at the market for a loaf of bread and a small jar of honey. It felt good to buy something just for myself. Back in my kitchen, I set the bread on a wooden board and sliced it thick, drizzling the honey until it pooled in the grain. I ate slowly, the way you savor a meal when you've earned it, not through labor, but through a decision that has been too long in coming. That night, I opened my new notebook and wrote. Today, I took the first step. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. What I felt was balanced, as though the ground beneath me had stopped tilting. He didn't know it, but the line between us had shifted. For the first time in years, I was no longer only the giver. I was the one holding something he might need, and unlike him, I knew exactly what I would do with that power. The first sign was in my kitchen. It had been months since I'd baked bread, not since the last time he'd come for dinner, which felt like another lifetime. But one afternoon, as the light slanted gold across the counters, I found myself pulling out the mixing bowl. The dough was stubborn at first, cold under my fingers, but as I kneaded it, my arms found a rhythm. I let the yeast rise in the warmth near the stove, the air slowly filling with that soft, living scent. It was an old ritual, one I used to do for him. Now, I was doing it for myself. The next sign came in my sleep. For weeks after he'd blocked me, my dreams had been restless. Doors closing, trains leaving, voices I couldn't reach. But now they began to change. I dreamed of walking along a quiet shoreline, the tide brushing my feet, no one else in sight. I woke up lighter. 3 days after my visit to the bank, Marianne called. Her voice was calm, professional. "There was an attempted withdrawal from the account," she said. "I thought you'd want to know." I felt no panic, no surprise, just a slow, steady current of satisfaction. "Thank you, Marianne," I said. "Please keep it as is." After I hung up, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. I imagined him at the teller's counter, card in hand, hearing the quiet refusal. I didn't wish him humiliation, but I did want him to pause, to feel the shift, however faint, in who held the ground between us. 2 days later, I received an email from him. Not a call, not a knock at my door. An email. "Hey, something's wrong with my account. Can you fix it?" No greeting, no question about how I was, no mention of the months of silence, just a request. I read it twice before closing my laptop. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I took my bread out of the oven, its crust crackling softly as it cooled. I sliced into it, steam curling upward, and spread butter that melted instantly. The next week I started walking into town again, something I hadn't done regularly since the rift between us began. The path was lined with sycamores just beginning to turn, their leaves pale gold against the blue sky. I nodded to shopkeepers, lingered at the florist's window, and bought myself a single white rose. I put the rose in a glass jar on the kitchen table. Every morning I noticed how it caught the light, how it stood without leaning. The email remained unanswered. I knew he'd be waiting for a reply, maybe checking his inbox between other things. That was fine. Let him wait. Marianne called again the following week. Another attempt to withdraw. This time he'd tried online. Same result. I thanked her, then went about my day. My steps felt different now, not lighter, exactly, but more deliberate. I was no longer drifting through the weeks. I was moving with purpose, even if that purpose was still a quiet one. That evening, I pulled out the old ledger and added a new note in the margin of the account's page. Control restored. The ink sank deep into the paper. It struck me that for so long, I had been living as if my only choices were to give or to retreat. Now I'd found a third option, to hold steady, without offering and without fleeing. He still didn't call, but the silence no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a wall I had built for myself, brick by brick, with no door unless I decided to open one. If you had the power to make someone who hurt you pause and reflect, would you use it? The decision came quietly, the way the first frost comes. One morning you wake, and the world is simply changed. It was late November. The light through the kitchen window was thin and pale, and the air held that faint metallic scent that always comes before snow. I sat with my tea, the steam curling against my face, and realized I was ready. I had been holding the account like a stone in my hand, feeling its weight, turning it over, testing its edges. Now it was time to set it down, not as an offering, but as a final act. The bank was quiet that morning. Only a few customers sat in the lobby, their voices muffled against the soft hum of the heaters. Marianne was there again, her blazer the same deep brown I remembered from my last visit. She greeted me with a small nod, as if she already knew why I had come. In her office, I didn't sit right away. "I want to close the account," I said. My voice didn't waver. She glanced at the screen, then back at me. "Entirely?" "Yes," I said. "Transfer the balance into my personal savings." There was no drama to it, no hesitation. The printer clicked and hummed, producing the final forms. As I signed, the pen felt heavier than usual, not with doubt, but with the weight of years. Every letter I wrote was another tie loosened. Marianne slid the receipt toward me. "It's done," she said simply. I folded the paper once and placed it in my bag. The balance, once a future I had been saving for him, was now mine again. Not as a prize, not as revenge in the sharp, bitter sense, but as something reclaimed. Walking home, I noticed the sky had shifted. Thick, low clouds gathering, ready to drop their first snow. I pulled my scarf tighter and let the cold air sting my cheeks. When I reached my porch, I paused before going inside. The garden was bare now, the lilac bush stripped to its branches, but the earth beneath it was strong, waiting for spring. I thought about the years I had tended it, watered it, pruned it, waited patiently for it to bloom. I thought about how some things you nurture return to you, others don't. Inside, I made myself lunch, thick slices of bread, sharp cheddar, an apple cut into neat wedges. I ate slowly, letting the quiet fill the house. There was no sense of loss, only space. That afternoon, I took the old ledger from its drawer. The page for his account was nearly full, numbers, dates, and my small notes in the margins. I closed the book, slid it back, and felt no urge to open it again. By evening, the first flakes of snow had begun to fall. They drifted past the window, catching the light from the street lamp. I stood there watching for a long while, the receipt still in my bag, its ink drying into permanence. The account was gone. The tether was cut. And for the first time in a long time, I was entirely on my own, by choice. It happened 2 days after the snowstorm. The phone rang late in the morning, a number I didn't recognize flashing across the screen. For a moment, I almost let it go to voicemail. But something, curiosity maybe, made me answer. "Mom?" His voice, sharp and tight. I said nothing for a second, letting the sound of it reach me fully. It had been so long since I'd heard it directed at me, and even now it was not warm. "I tried to get into my account," he said quickly. "It's empty. What the hell happened?" I could hear the wind through the line, traffic in the background. He was calling from somewhere outside, but his tone was all forward thrust, no pause. "I closed it," I said. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "The money is mine again." There was a beat of silence and then, "You can't do that. It's my account." "It was always my account," I said. "In my name. I kept it for you all these years, waiting for you to be ready to use it with care." "You had no right," he began, but I didn't let him finish. "I had every right," I said, still steady. "What I didn't have was respect, not from you." The quiet that followed was heavier this time. I imagined him standing somewhere with the phone to his ear, trying to find the words to push against mine. "This is petty," he said finally. "You're punishing me because I didn't call enough, because I didn't invite you to every little thing." I let his words hang there, as if they might reshape themselves if left alone. They didn't. "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm protecting what's mine, including my dignity." For a moment I thought I heard him inhale to argue again. Instead, there was a long, empty pause, and then the faint click of the line going dead. I stood in the kitchen, the phone still in my hand, listening to the kettle begin its slow build toward a whistle. The snow outside had turned to a fine drizzle, tapping gently against the window. I set the phone down on the counter, filled the kettle, and struck a match to light the burner. Steam began to curl upward, ghostly and soft, as if the whole moment could dissolve into the air. By the time the whistle came, I felt no anger, only a quiet certainty that some silences are better left unbroken. If you finally stood up to someone you loved, could you live with the silence afterward? Months have passed. The snow melted into the soil, feeding the roots beneath, and now the garden is stirring again. The lilac bush has begun to green at its tips, buds swelling with the promise of bloom. He hasn't called, not once, and I no longer measure my days by that absence. Life has taken on its own steady rhythm, mornings with tea and the soft rustle of the newspaper, afternoons tending to the roses, evenings with a book and the sound of the wind moving through the fence. The account money sits in my savings now. I don't spend it quickly or rashly. It's not about the sum, it's about the fact that it's mine, reclaimed, like a room in a house I thought I'd lost. Sometimes in the quiet of early morning, I think about him. Not with bitterness. More like you think of an old photograph, something from a time that feels impossibly far away. I remember the boy with sticky hands and a laugh that could lift an entire afternoon. I remember the smell of cinnamon toast and the way he used to run down the hallway when I came home from work. Those memories are mine too. They can't be blocked. One afternoon, I polished the dented tin mailbox at the end of the drive, the one he painted for me when he was small. The paint is faded now, the letters of my name barely legible, but I keep it just the same. It's a relic, yes, but also a reminder. Some things age into a kind of beauty you don't try to restore. You simply let them be. The lilacs will open soon. I'll cut a few and place them in a jar on the kitchen table, their scent drifting through the rooms. No one else needs to see them to make them real. Closure, I've learned, isn't a slam door or a dramatic speech. It's a soft lock clicking into place, a choice you make every day to keep what's yours and let go of what isn't. And as I sip my tea, the garden outside leaning toward spring, I know, truly, that I am at peace.